Welcome everyone. This lecture is going to cover oxygen and oxygenation, and it is somewhat based in physiology. And I guess it's not kind of a misnomer to say pathophysiology in this lecture, but what I'm trying to get at is a better understanding of how oxygen is used in our to deliver to our tissues and use for work, so that you can understand when things go wrong how important oxygen is, and to sort of learn a little bit more about this critter called oxygen and oxygenation. And that's my goal, because so much of pathophysiology will come from hypoxia, where you don't have enough oxygen, and it can result from any sort of disease situations. Right now, as I'm recording this lecture, we're in the middle of a pandemic from the coronavirus, and one of the problems with this whole virus is that it affects the lungs, and the ability to for the lungs to deliver oxygen to blood, so that blood can take it to tissues, and tissues can offload that oxygen and use it to do cellular work. So oxygenation, again, this is meant to be a solid review, because so much is involved with oxygenation. But it's the delivery of oxygen to the tissues of the body, and that is essential for the functions of life. It is more than just breathing, but it all starts there when we take in air from our environment. Oxygen from the air must be delivered to the cells of our body, so that we can create ATP to do cellular work. And that's mostly done in the mitochondria, where we take that oxygen and use it to make ATP. This ATP energy drives our cellular work, and without it, our tissues would be starved of oxygen. They would fail, the membranes of cells would fail, and we would end up soon with organ systems collapsing, because we would be unable to do the work that organ is designed to do. Gases must be exchanged between our environment, and this happens as we take in air, but as it gets into our bodies, what we're really talking about is right here on the slide, how oxygen will go from our lungs. It'll saturate a red blood cell. It'll be carried in the bloodstream and delivered to and released for tissues to use to do work. Both of these processes involve hemoglobin, which is the carrier protein for oxygen, and the ability to oxygen to bind with hemoglobin between the lungs and the blood, and the ability of oxygen to be released is there's a great deal of science behind it, and that's kind of what we're going to be getting at with these topics today. We will be using I'll use this analogy first, and then I'll get onto some terms. Think of the analogy as a subway, and if you've never been on a subway, it's a train, and think of the tunnels that the train is going in, or the track, as your veins. Think of the entire subway car as the blood, and then individual cars, think of those as blood cells, and then think of the people as oxygen. And the goal is to put people on and off of that car to get oxygen in and out. And so as the subway travels, it will pick up, and that's called affinity, and then it'll drop off people. And when we drop off, that's the term is dissociation. In a best case scenario, we have a full car, because we want to get the maximum amount of money for our train ride if you're the conductor. And so that would be a term that we would refer to as saturated. But when you get into certain illnesses such as COPD and similar respiratory issues, the cars are a little bit less full. There's not as much oxygen in the air. All right. So again, to recap these terms, these are threme main terms. The affinity refers to the suitability of oxygen to get on a hemoglobin. The red blood cell does no good if the oxygen can't get on that heme atom, or that the hemoglobin that we need. Saturation is how much oxygen is actually on that hemoglobin, on that red blood cell. There's more than one hemoglobin, but how much does it actually get placed on the red blood cell and the hemoglobin? And then dissociation is a term for how well it leaves, and all of those things are important. All right, oxygen must get from the air and outside to the capillaries, and it's going to do this, it's got to get to the capillaries in the lungs. And to do this, the air down the bronchial tubes, and eventually it lands on these little air sacs called the alveoli that you've hopefully heard of in your anus. And that's basically where gas exchanges. So you have the air sitting in these little thin sacs, and you have the capillaries nearby. And it's basically going to be pressure and diffusion by the partial pressures of all the gases in those areas is going to move oxygen and distribute it, okay? And so, like I said, the key terms are affinity, saturation, and dissociation, but the things that, there's kind of variables that we're going to talk about. We're going to add a few more words. But the two terms that we're going to add are ventilation and perfusion. And you know a little bit about these words. Think about what you already know. Ventilation refers to the amount of air that's filling up that sac. If you think of a balloon, if you have a little limp balloon, it doesn't have much ventilation. It would, if that's the air sac in your lungs, it needs to be full so that it can have enough pressure to push into the blood vessels that are the capillaries that are there. Perfusion is the amount of blood that's in the capillaries. You have to have blood so that oxygen can land on the red blood cells. And so there's two things that have to happen. You have to have enough air in the air sacs, and you have to have a volume of blood going by at that capillary part where the air sac meets the capillaries in order to have exchange of the gases. And we typically refer to this when there's a mismatch as a VQ mismatch. And that's what I want to talk about. All right, so a V2 mismatch is really not that hard, and mostly I'm introducing it to you right now. What you need is a balance between enough air in the air sacs and enough blood going by so that you have good exchange of gases. And it's quantified by a number, and it's ventilation divided by perfusion is the formula right here, V divided by Q. Remember, V stands for ventilation and Q in this case stands for perfusion. And so a normal relationship between the pressures that you need and the volumes of all these things that are needed is around 0.8. All right, and we're not going to get into the calculations, but I want you to know, this kind of model, which way it sort of goes. So if the ratio is high, like as in over here on the right, you're going to have, it would indicate a problem with perfusion. You have good ventilation. You can see this little circle is the alveoli, but it's not properly perfused, and you get what's called a dead space. And this could be an example of something that happens in cardiac arrest. If you have a problem with, it's called shunt perfusion, there's enough blood to perfuse the area, but there's not enough ventilation in the air sacs. And so in the alveoli technically, and so that's a problem that's called shunt perfusion, where you would have a low VQ and hypoxemia would result in this case. And so either case actually. So you want the right ventilation, and the main thing about this is the relationship between the air pushing on the alveoli and the amount of blood that's going through has to be in the right proportion to get the correct perfusion. All right, sorry, I had to take a little break. So the other thing I'd like to talk to you about is partial pressure. All right, so we have, like I said, the oxygen is going to move on or off of the blood cell, and same with carbon dioxide, based on partial pressures. And this will come into play later when we look at how the ability to get on and off affects certain conditions as well, the dissociation curve. But just so that you know, it needs to get on, it needs to get off. And remember that these are gases, and that gases will move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. And that is a fundamental rule. So if pressures and other factors are going to help this binding and release, but pressure is the most relative in this case, and it's a gradient that's going to be created. And again, it's going to go from higher to lower. If the pressure of the gas is higher in one area compared to another, then the molecule will move from the area that's higher to the area that's lower. This is what's actually going on and moving oxygen from your lungs to your red blood cells and eventually to your tissues in your bodies. It all depends on where the pressure is higher. So if you're going to move oxygen from the alveoli to the blood, the pressure has to be higher on the alveoli side than the blood side, and you're going to be able to move that oxygen. And the reverse is true. If you want to go, remember, your tissues are going to take carbon dioxide and put it back into the blood. And so the pressure there would have to be higher for the carbon dioxide to get pushed out to the blood. So it's always going to be about these partial pressures. And that's one of the main points to make about this ability to bind or to be released. Okay. Whoops, let's not go there yet.